Sclerotinia white mold is a problem in soybeans in many areas, and it can
other
also
crops.
and it can also be an issue in sunflowers and dry beans, several other crops. So today we want to talk about the best control methods for your farm.
All right, first of all, if I have a white mold problem, I know I've got a white mold problem historically in a field, there are going to be sclerotia, or basically the little seeds for the next generation of white mold laying out in your field. So the big thing and the best management practice you can take is trying to control them right away. Now, some farmers would say, well, I'm going to do tillage. I'm going to try to bury them so I don't have to deal with them. And that is an option. You certainly can do that. You can use a product like Contans. What Contans does is it's a biological product that will actually feed on the sclerotia. So it's a natural product that you're putting back out into the soil that's going to be the natural predator for those sclerotia. That's its food source. So if you do that right after you have a white mold issue, like let's just say this year you had a problem in your soybeans or in your sunflowers, well, as soon as harvest is done, I'd get the Contans out there and let it start working on that right away. Do no tillage, leave the sclerotia in place, let the product work. If you get it out in the fall, you've got that much more time before the next crop will be in the ground. Now let's say you're going to go to corn the next year and then soybeans 2 years away. That's fine. Eat those sclerotia up. If you can clean up most of the seed, by the time you plant your susceptible crop like soybeans a couple years from now, you won't have much of a problem.
We used to have some white mold problems on our farm. Here's another option for you. Plant corn for a few years. We took some fields and we planted corn 2 years in a row, and just that 2 years out of soybeans, by the time we went back to soybeans, we didn't have nearly as much problem. Now, obviously, weather plays a huge factor in this. If you don't have the right weather conditions, you're not going to have a big white mold problem. What happens is you're going to see the germination, we'll call it, of the sclerotia, and it will be mushrooms. So if you see mushrooms out in your field, understand that, hey, those could be white mold mushrooms, and they're going to literally shoot spores out at your plants, and your plants are most susceptible right after flowering. Like with soybeans, flowering begins in late June. So in early July, that's where this infection can start getting into the plant the easiest.
All right, at that point, you know that you're going to have an opening in the plant when you've got flowers that bloom and then dry up. And that's where we've got, like Brian was saying, the white mold's chance to come in. So when you think about that, white mold is a fungus. That means we can use a fungicide to try to prevent that problem. So we want to be out there right at R1 when we're seeing first bloom. That's your shot. Get out there ahead of white mold and say, okay, I know it's coming, so I'm going to prepare. I'm going to spray something ahead of time. Maybe it's Domark.
Well, let's talk about those products. Okay, the best product is Endura. The next as a step down is Proline. And the next as a step down at the bottom is Domark. Okay, now I'm not saying Domark is bad, but Domark is dramatically less expensive than Endura. So almost no soybean farmer I know is going to spend the 4 or 5 times more money to go out there with Endura. But if you had a crop like sunflowers or dry beans where you got a lot of money on the line here, then I get it. Use Endura. Use a good product that is labeled. But in our case, what we usually do before we even use a fungicide, if we were worried about white mold, we might spray Cobra right before flowering. That kind of thins out all the leaves, and then we move more air through, and we get almost as good a control as you will with Domark.
All right, so we talked about a few products that actually work on white mold control. There are a lot of products that really don't. So we think about the most popular fungicide used across the country is Headline, or many different combinations that it's in. Preaxor would be one, for example. We think about Stratego Yield, Quilt, real popular, really good fungicides. White mold just happens to be one of those diseases they don't really do much for.
Right.
So there are other choices if you've got white mold. So if you have no white mold issue, fine, use those products. But if white mold's a concern, how much are we stepping back on some of the other disease control and things by going to a Domark?
You're hardly stepping back at all. You're going to maybe give up a little bit of the plant health side, but Domark is really good on the other diseases.
Okay, just a couple more comments. There is no genetic resistance in soybeans. So if you're thinking, well, I'll just get a white mold resistant bean, there aren't any that are resistant. Now, there are some that are more tolerant than others. You can certainly talk to your seed provider about, hey, which of these varieties that I'm going to plant would be the best on white mold? If they're big, bushy beans, chances are they probably aren't your best ones for white mold tolerance. Now, the other thing is row spacing is going to really come into play, and plant population. For weed control, we like narrower rows, higher populations. For white mold control, we like wider rows, lower populations. So you have to weigh those two things out. If you're having issues with weeds in a field, you may be forced to narrow things up and plant a little thicker bean population. But if white mold's a concern, you better use all the management practices you can to try and stop it.
Well, unfortunately, those management practices aren't going to do much for controlling our weed of the week, but we'll tell you what will coming up later in the show.